Hi, and welcome to the second event of the spring semester for the Center for Free Enterprise. I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise. And this semester, we decided to examine blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And earlier, we brought in Will Luther. And on April 10th at 4:30 in here, we're going to have Julie Stackhouse and David Andelfato from the St. Louis Fed, and they're going to discuss blockchain and the merits of central bank digital currency. So we'll kind of get the Fed point of view on digital currencies, which I think will be pretty interesting. By the way, U of L has a blockchain club. If you're interested, several of the members are in the audience up here in the front. So you should definitely check them out and join the club. And you can talk to them after the event today. Also, one more event that at least I'll be participating in, and this is going to be on March 20th at 4:30 in the Chow Auditorium. I'm going to be with Professor Avery Kohlers of Philosophy, Vicki Jones from Pan-African Studies, and Anita Moorman from Sport Administration, and we're going to discuss whether or not college athletes should be paid. And there's been a lot of change in NCAA and other rules since we first came up with this idea last year, but it ought to be kind of an interesting talk. All right, as you came in, you should have received a survey about today's program. Please take a couple of minutes to fill that out and let us know what you think. We use your comments and suggestions to plan our future programming. And also, if you're here for class requirement, you must completely fill out the survey to get credit for being here. So, Bitcoin's a decentralized cryptocurrency without a central bank. Also, many early enthusiasts thought Bitcoin was a way to separate money from the state. The argument for deeper regulation and oversight of Bitcoin has been in the news recently after Gerald Cotton, CEO and founder of Canada's largest cryptocurrency exchange, died and left $145 million of Bitcoin completely inaccessible. And in another area, regulators at the Security and Exchange Commission argued that Gladius Network broke laws by selling digital tokens, even as one of its commissioners at the SEC said the SEC misunderstands crypto and doesn't know what they're doing. So the question is, do we need regulation of Bitcoin? Well, today we're going to find out. We've got two Bitcoin experts to discuss the issue of regulating Bitcoin. Naomi Brockwell is a film and television producer and host of the tech show Bitcoin, Blockchain, and the Technologies of Our Future. She's producer for the Stossel Show and a producer for the sci-fi TV series Hard Fork. It's going to be a great show, by the way. And formerly, it's going to sound like Trump. It formerly produced for Fox Business Network and Fox News Channel. Naomi is co-founder of the Soho Forum. She sat on the advisory council at the Mancal Economic Education Foundation, was policy associate at the New York Bitcoin Center from 2013 to 2015, and has been making videos about Bitcoin since 2013. Check them out on YouTube. Sasha Hodder is an attorney at DLT Law Group, where she focuses on the virtual currency sector. She helps her clients navigate the growing regulations surrounding cryptocurrency. She's a frequent guest on the Tonevay's Law Review Show and hosts her own podcast on crypto law, the Holocast. You can check that out also online. She started her career as a Series 7 licensed trader and gained ground level perspective of the equities market and the intricacies of global economics. So I want to thank Naomi and Sasha for being here today with us and to help us understand a little bit more about cryptocurrency and its regulation. So I'm going to just let them kind of tell you what's going on. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. So we're delighted to be here. Is this thing on? It's kind of, no?
Yeah.
It is? You can hear me all right? All right, great. Yeah, we're really excited to be here. We've been talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency for a long time, and I think that more than ever, I would say that regulation is a topic of interest for people. I would say that 2018 is probably like the year of regulation for crypto. I saw it ramping up in a lot of different areas, so we want to talk about that. But just before we start, I wanted to kind of gauge where the audience is at in terms of exposure to cryptocurrency. So who here has heard of Bitcoin? Who here owns Bitcoin? Who here is interested in perhaps like maybe one day purchasing Bitcoin? A few people. All right, and so Bitcoin is fascinating. It kind of came out of, and we'll just give like a brief overview. There were a few people who didn't put their hands up who knew anything about it. Like, I mean, it's tough to explain and it's tough to understand, and I find that there's a lot of FUD out there. So fear, uncertainty, doubt. Mainstream media puts a lot of this out because whatever bleeds leads, right? You know, you have an article that says crypto is a bubble and it's died. You're going to get a lot of clicks on that. So I think Bitcoin has died like hundreds of times so far. So we just kind of want to clear some of that up and explain what this is. So for me, I'll start just to give an overview. Bitcoin is like money for the internet. Right? And the way it really started was, I mean, if you think about this digital age that we're living in right now, and you think about when you load up your computer and someone sends you a picture, right? You have a JPEG sitting there. You have this digital asset. And it's super easy just to screenshot that and send it to someone else. Send it to 100 more people. Or perhaps you just copy the file and send it to 1,000 more people. So you have these digital assets that could just easily be copied. You have someone sending you a movie file. That can be copied infinitely and sent to as many people as you want. So basically what happened with Bitcoin is someone figured out how to have a digital asset that could not be reproduced. And obviously when you have something like that, the consequences of things that are rare, have some sort of scarcity, is that it could potentially be used for money. And this was something that people had worked on for a really, really long time. So there were people in what's called the cypherpunk mailing list who are very interested in having a different form of money. Like, how do we have a competing currency? How do we have one that can't be shut down? And this was something that was in the ethos of the people on this cypherpunk mailing list. And the reason why they wanted this was because there are a lot of things that go on in finance that are corrupt. There's a lot of stuff going on in there that some people thought, hey, we don't want to be part of this, we want to find another alternative. Now, what happened prior to Bitcoin, if we look at the history of this, is, and then we'll go into like regulation after that, but what happened prior to Bitcoin was you actually had a lot of digital currencies that were created, and a lot of alternative currencies, and a lot of currencies backed by gold, and like all of these things. And what happened every single time was either the government shut them down because there is a centralized focal point that could be shut down, and the government said, we don't want a competing currency, or they failed because they didn't have a good network effect. No one was going to accept, you know, Naomi coin, because they're like, I don't think I could sell this again. No one else is going to accept it. You know, this doesn't work as money for me. So there were lots of precursors that just didn't work. And then Bitcoin came along, and someone called Satoshi Nakamoto wrote this white paper where they figured out, first of all, how to make a digital asset that couldn't be reproduced, which was the first time anyone has been able to do this, and it's a real revolution. And they figured out how to have a decentralized system, which is, again, huge. If you think about precursors that have been shut down because there's a central focal point, meaning that, say, there was a company that the government could say, oh, we're shutting down the X company, right? We're going to put the CEO in jail. Like, there's a focal point that could be shut down. Bitcoin is a system that can't be shut down. That's huge. It's a decentralized system, and it's fascinating because it's not just a decentralized system that could be applied to cryptocurrency. It's a way of decentralizing trust, which can be applied to the way corporations are built, which can be applied to the way, you know, we keep records, we keep data, we have medical records, we have land titling. There are all of these different applications, and really the killer app right now, the biggest application we've seen, is the first application that Satoshi came up with, which is cryptocurrency. And so this is kind of how this thing evolved. A lot of people trying to figure out how to do this, and just sort of to finish off like this history of where this came from. When you had the first Bitcoin that was ever created, Satoshi wrote into the code. He wrote January 3rd, 2009, the Times, which is the name of a newspaper in England. Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. So Bitcoin was a solution, but it was a statement. What was happening at the time of 2009, or the precursor when Bitcoin was created, like 2008, a few years before that, you had a huge amount of TARP bailouts. You had the government bailing out giant financial institutions that should have known better, and you had taxpayers footing the bill. What happens when the government prints a whole bunch of money and gives it to these banks? Well, the money that you're holding in your pockets becomes devalued because it's not as scarce, right? So this is like a hidden tax that was applied. You had someone called Satoshi who said, listen, I'm going to work on a solution to this, because no longer do I want the control of my money in a centralized institution where it can be devalued so easily. I want to have financial sovereignty. I want to have financial autonomy. I don't want my money in a bank account where they could just steal a certain percentage of the assets, like what happened in Cyprus. I don't want my money in a bank account where the government can just print so much of it and devalue it, like what's happened in Venezuela, or what happened in Argentina, or what happened in America in the 70s, and may happen again, because to be honest, we don't have control over what happens to the US dollar. That's not in our hands. And so someone came up with a system that said, this is a solution and an alternative for people. And so that's really where Bitcoin came from, and sort of like the background there. And I'll hand it over to you to kind of talk about like some of the implications of that and where we've gone from there.
Sure, thanks Naomi. Yeah, that was a great explanation of it, the history. And when it was first created, it was kind of flying under the radar, and I don't think much attention came from the government until I believe the first American regulation that was put forth was the IRS said that it was property. In 2014, they said this is going to be taxed like property, and which is very different from how we tax currency. And if we're going to buy a coffee, you don't have to calculate how much you bought that dollar bill for and how much you sold it for. But the way that the cryptocurrency is taxed is as if it were a stock that you were, selling your Apple stock in exchange for your, consumer goods, which it really doesn't make a lot of sense from a spending standpoint. But then it has evolved so that there's many different government entities that have put some kind of regulation on Bitcoin, and all the regulation that can come down on this thing is an effort by the government, but it's very difficult to enforce. And they have been successful in certain arenas, but there's a meme on the internet showing the government trying to regulate Bitcoin, and it's a little fence and a guy like standing behind it, but then there's a wide open space on either side. And that's, I think, what's so exciting and what has drawn so much development and excitement and enthusiasm from the Bitcoin community. But it's, so the first thing was the tax, and then we come to, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And we know since 9/11, America has really stepped up its security or its monitoring of our financial movements. And that's part of what the cypherpunks were really concerned about, is that why is every time we spend something, every time we go to a hotel or take a flight, we're tracked? Like it's very much a system of surveillance on us every time we use our debit card.
It wasn't always like that either. This is something that is recent. It's so normalized now. We just presume that everything is going to be monitored. But to open a bank account 20 years ago, you didn't even need to show an ID a lot of the time. Like I hear stories from Bruce Fenton, who's an awesome person in the space, who talks about his experience. He's been involved in securities, and he's been in traditional finance for forever. And he talks about how unregulated it is, and how there was so much more financial freedom there. But it's become so normalized now. Like the tracking, I think, is such an important point to look at how the monetary system is developed.
Absolutely. And so then with this Patriot Act, it's created a situation where every person that's what's considered a money service business or a money service provider, so that's if you're, think of Western Union as a very easy way to, think about it. You give Western Union your money, Western Union transmits it to a third party, that creates a money transmission, and Western Union has to have a way of knowing whose money it is, what the source of funds are, and basically a way to stop people from using Western Union to fund terrorists or to buy drugs. or any kind of nefarious act. So if they're doing anything illegal with the money. So then they put that same, regulation onto cryptocurrency, that anyone that's going to send it as a business. So this is at a federal level. Anyone that's there's 3 different categories. So there's a user, there's an exchanger, and there's an administrator. So if you're a user of cryptocurrency, this would be an example of Naomi and I doing a trade. Like, I sell her a bicycle, she gives me some Bitcoin. That's not required to do anything with FinCEN. But as soon as I'm a business in the business of exchanging or doing anything involving cryptocurrency, then I would be considered an exchanger. So if I sell bikes for Bitcoin all the time, then it implicates it. And there's a lot of caveats on that. If it's a physical good, it's different than if you're just selling currency. That's more where they're focused on. Then you have to have a compliance program in place, and you have to be able to know your customer, and you have to have an anti-money laundering program, and that's what the government has said. And if you're an administrator of cryptocurrency, so if you're a fund creating your own coin, then you also have to have this this federal regulation. And there haven't been a ton of enforcements around it, but there have been a few.
Or a ton of clarity.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's been happening in crypto that, since the early days, I know a lot of people who started businesses, maybe they'd start like an online gambling site or something for cryptocurrency, or they'd be selling money, or they start an exchange, and there's just no clarity from the government. Because we're dealing with a completely new asset class that we're yet to wrap our heads around. And I think that when you're talking about like all of the traditional financial tools and FinCEN and the IRS and all of this, what we need to keep in mind is that we have something that was specifically engineered to exist outside of this financial infrastructure. It was literally engineered so that it was decentralized, couldn't be shut down, wasn't part of this traditional system, didn't need a middleman, all of this stuff. And what's happening now is you have a ton of regulation that's saying, oh, how do we shoehorn this into this thing here? And what needs to happen in the space is our understanding needs to evolve, and we need to realize that perhaps the traditional structure, it can't support this new types of assets, because we have all these different types of financial tools now that it's really hard to shoehorn into this traditional system, right? And why is that? Like, first of all, let's look at all the different things that you have now, not just like currencies, but you have all these types of derivatives and securities, and we have things that the government doesn't know how to classify. Sasha mentioned at the start that they're classifying it as all different things. Some people were classifying it as a commodity, some were classifying it as a currency, and there's all this debate in different government sectors about this, because we're dealing with something entirely new that the government doesn't quite understand yet. And what we're seeing is them trying to figure out, okay, so how do we, if we want anti-money laundering to still apply to this, if we want know your customer laws to apply, how do we do this with an asset that is kind of outside of our control? And how do they do it? It's at the on and off ramps. So when you're converting from your bank account, like if you're converting from cash into cryptocurrency, that's where they're trying to assert their, the companies that are doing that are complying with tracking who's, KYC, like know your customer. You have to input your information when you're buying it on a place like Coinbase or certain exchanges. But other exchanges that are maybe domiciled outside of America are not adhering to those rules. So it's kind of a balancing act. The companies that are here, a lot of them are in compliance. Like we recently saw Coinbase acquire a blockchain tracking company called, is it Neutrino? That had, the team that they acquired, they paid, what was it, $13.5 million for these people that were supposedly experts at what's called chain analysis, where they track, if you purchase Bitcoin, they'll look at where that Bitcoin has gone in the past and try and decipher what people you've been associated with. And they've started creating what's called a whitelist and a blacklist.
So certain people are okay to transact Bitcoin with, and other people that maybe have had addresses associated with the Silk Road, or are from a country called Iran, or anyone that's on a terrorist list or associated with some nefarious activity, their accounts are flagged. So then if you have any dealing with those accounts, then these blockchain tracking companies will likely flag your account too.
And then that's something that we should talk more about as well, about the fungibility of Bitcoin, and about some things associated with that. So let's talk about that anecdote of when.
Are we taking? There's someone with a question too.
We'll ask questions. Okay. Get questions in a second. We just want to kind of give you a broad sense of where we're at the moment, and I'd also love to talk about the philosophy of should Bitcoin be included in the system. That's a question we can ask. But what's happened is the idea of Bitcoin. I mean, I don't know where to start with this. So essentially what happened is the Department of Treasury, right? They put out a list that said we're blacklisting a bunch of addresses and a bunch of coins, and saying, you can't associate with these people, you can't get money from them. They're taboo and off limits. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of the people in the Bitcoin community. So, I mean, you have two strains of thought here. You have one strain that says, listen, we don't want bad people doing bad things. If we can find a way to stop them and track them and stop them getting resources, then great. And on the other side, you have people saying, listen, we live in a giant surveillance state where every single transaction is monitored and surveilled, and finally we have a tool to get outside of that system. That's what we should be using this for. This is a tool for financial freedom. And we're seeing this conflict of these two sides playing out right now. And what happened when the Department of Treasury put out this list of addresses, you had like hundreds, thousands of people just spamming the addresses. Like as soon as the Department of Treasury said, these are off limits, do not send any money, you had all these people, like thousands of people just sending microtransactions, sending like 0.0001 penny to these addresses with notes attached, because you can put data in the blockchain saying, like, F you, Department of Treasury, freedom, long live autonomy, all these things. So I doubt anyone said long live autonomy. No one said that. But you get the general sentiment of what's going on, because we're really seeing a clash right now, and we're not quite sure which way it's going to play. But what we are seeing develop is this very strong regulatory environment where the government more and more, like the SEC is getting more and more involved, IRS is getting more and more involved, FinCEN is getting more and more involved. But then you're also having technologists who are developing better tools. You're getting better privacy coins, ones that can't be monitored as easily. You're getting decentralized exchanges so that people don't have to get a money transmitter's license and be involved with the SEC at all. Everything is decentralized. There's no single point of failure that could be shut down. And we're not sure how this clash is going to end up. And there are different schools of thought on what people in the space should do. Like I interviewed Ron Paul about this, and I actually loved his response. I asked him, what should people in the blockchain space be doing right now? What is your suggestion? There's going to be a giant clash coming up. This is something that gives people a lot more financial power. I mean, you look what happened with WikiLeaks, right? The government said, we don't like this, what's happening. You're exposing these secrets. We're going to shut you down, not by closing the website, but by shutting down donations. They put pressure on intermediaries like PayPal and MasterCard and Visa, and just said, listen, you guys have to stop processing transactions to this website, which they did. WikiLeaks would have disappeared at that stage. They had no funding, they had no vehicle for getting this information out. But then they started accepting Bitcoin, and then they thrived, and then the market went up, because the first bull run we saw in Bitcoin was the WikiLeaks wave, where all of these people came on board and said, wow, this is a way I can still be giving money to something even if the government doesn't allow it. You think about in America what that applies to. It applies to everything to do with like the black market and what's taboo and all of that. But you think about what the consequences of that are in a country like China or in Venezuela, where the black market literally consists of medicine and food and clothing. Like, this is an incredible tool that could empower the individual when you have a dictatorship or a bad state actor that is trying to curtail people's freedom. There's a lot of consequences of this technology. So Ron Paul's answer And when I asked him, he said, what should they be doing? There's an upcoming battle. Government's not going to take this lying down. They want to maintain their power, especially if they're like a bad government. You know, there are lots of those around the world. And he said, do not concede to government. Do not like give them an inch. You know, it's this brand of thought that says, you know, one of them says, let's work together, let's figure this out. You know, we're all on the same team. There's another that says, listen, you've taken over too much of our lives with surveillance. You're already encroaching on our territory. This is the one thing we have left, and we're not going to give an inch of that. So he said, don't concede, you know, because once you get interference, it grows, and soon it'll be overrun. So we're going to have to see what happens with Bitcoin and which direction it goes, or with cryptocurrency in general.
Yeah, I kind of see it going in two paths. Like one where it does comply and people use it as a tool for investments, and it kind of just becomes another method of payment. And then there's the other one for freedom that kind of develops with second layer tools. Like now, we had this discussion last night, but like there's the Lightning Network, or there's new protocols coming that really focus on privacy. And what that's supposed to do is kind of obfuscate who's done the transaction, so that it makes it very difficult for government actors to obtain the identity of whoever made that transaction. The way I picture it, and I'm not a super technical person, but it's like if you put everyone in here did a transaction, and then it just got all mixed up, and then one transaction went back onto the blockchain. There would be no way to know who did what inside of that transaction that went onto the chain. So that is kind of a very, very simple and maybe a little bit wrong explanation of how the privacy technology is developing, but it basically makes it so that it's very difficult to track anything. So I think that stuff is getting worked on, and then there's also a huge push of coins everyone that really wants to make a lot of money in the space, like there's companies very focused on profit that kind of came in with this, the capitalism mentality, which is there on both sides. But then there's, the people that are running exchanges, the people that did these initial coin offerings, everyone creating their own alternative currency or trying to do some kind of service that helps the market. If they want to operate a business in America, they do have to comply with the regulation, whether they believe in the regulation or not. It's just the cost of doing business if you don't want to get shut down, or ultimately if you want to stay out of jail with some of these regulations. So I think there's a lot of push towards how to make your company compliant, and then there's a second side of this technology that's a push to how to make your technology invisible. So it's exciting watching them both grow up,
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's very important to look at the side of regulation and compliance in a different light. So it's not just a rhetoric of this is clean cut, we're doing good things, we're obeying the law, we're catching bad people. There's a lot of corruption in that industry that people have to be aware of when they think of, does regulation have a place in cryptocurrency? And a great example is the New York Bit license. So I was at the license hearings in 2014, and the rhetoric there astounded me, because you think 2014, who knew about Bitcoin in 2014? Raise your hand. Like very few people, right? It was really small, and I go back to Australia and I mentioned this thing, no one had heard of it. No one had heard of this thing at all. And so you're thinking about the bit license hearings where the government was trying to decide, okay, how do we regulate these things? And they did the right thing. They had a hearing where they had people on both sides give their case, because this is a very new technology, very few people understood it. And the entire hearing was completely co-opted, and it was really disgusting to watch, actually. What ended up happening was the bit license was introduced by bureaucrats, essentially, who didn't understand the tech at all, had no experience with it. They weren't developers. They did as much research as they could. But it's a little more nefarious than that, because the architect of the bit license is a man named Ben Lawsky, and he created this system that basically made it impossible for people to do business in New New York. So immediately, the exchange Kraken shut its doors, Giant Exchange shut its doors, Shapeshift shut its doors in New York. There are so many services that I can't get in New York City because I live in New York, right? And that was terrible to see because New York was booming before that. There was so many jobs being created. There was so much exciting innovation being worked on, and all of that disappeared. And I think it took 4 years. In 4 years, there were like 4-bit license issued. 4. You think about like the hundreds of companies based in New York at that time, 4-bit licenses were issued, which meant that only those 4 companies could legally do business. They, like all the exchanges, money transfer, all of that, they all left. And since then, I think like 12-bit licenses have been issued. And I say that this is nefarious because you think, oh, well, maybe the government just didn't get this, The architect of the bit license, Ben Lawsky, ended up leaving and becoming an advisor to companies to help them navigate the bit license. And that's the sort of regulatory capture that you see so often, and that's why I take pause. Like, I want to catch bad guys, I want things to be done well, I want a great society, but then when you see this sort of regulatory capture where someone literally creates a system that's so hard to navigate that like a handful of people in 6 years have even been granted a license to do business, and this guy ends up joining the board of a company that just happened to be granted one of these bit licenses, one of 4 companies at the time granted this bit license. It gets very incestuous, it gets very corrupt, and that's a lot of the time what tends to happen with regulation being introduced. So you just got to be really careful when you're looking into this and not just take the rhetoric of, we're trying to do good. Look at the unintended consequences that can happen from this stuff. And like just on that note, the one other point I wanted to make was with regards to black market and using crypto for all these nefarious things. What we've actually seen in the last year, which has been fascinating, is because it's almost like we're saying the only use case for crypto is these black markets. If you want control, if you want to give to WikiLeaks and the government doesn't want you to, you can use Bitcoin, right? If you want to give money to someone that the government doesn't like the political rhetoric with, you can use this tool. There are ways to get around it. But there are legal use cases now that are fascinating to watch and are really exciting because the value proposition of Bitcoin is growing and growing the more we see these use cases. And this is of social media monetization. Now, who's been keeping up with all of the people being deplatformed from YouTube and Patreon? And when there was a huge purge from Patreon. Who does anyone not know what Patreon is? Everyone, okay, well, I'll explain. So Patreon is like a monetization service where people can give like a monthly donation. If you like a content creator, you can give them a monthly donation and become like a patron of theirs. The way they used to do in Schubert's time, and they had a patron, and then they could create their art and be monetized and make it sustainable. So that was great. And you started to see all this deplatforming of people if others didn't like their ideas. So YouTube purged a bunch of people, and then Patreon, they started out purging a bunch of people, and they were saying, well, actually, it's MasterCard that's making us do this, and it's not us; it's the payment processor we're using, and then they did this giant purge, and it was like, no, we're actually purging these people. We don't want them to be monetized on our platforms. People lost entire livelihoods. Like, I'll point to Naomi Wu, who's a Chinese YouTuber who has a great tech show. She just has a tech show, and she was deplatformed from Patreon. She earned all of her money on Patreon. So the supporters she has like millions of subscribers on YouTube. The support she gets is just from her fans. That's how she made a living, and they deplatformed her, so she lost all of that. And then you had Subscribestar pop up and say, whoa, we're a Patreon alternative, come to us. And everyone went to them who was deplatformed from Patreon. They went to Subscribestar, they're like, okay, we can remonetize. And then PayPal and Stripe pulled their services from the entire platform and said, you now no longer have a payment provider. So you see the amount of control that payment providers wield in society by curtailing speech. And so then what you saw is the rise of alternatives that don't rely on payment providers. Now, what do they revolve around? Cryptocurrency. So you see all these places pop up that say, we will help you monetize. You use cryptocurrency, you can earn a living. Now, these people aren't doing anything illegal. They're just making videos, they're making art, they're singing, they're writing poetry. And now they actually have a way to make that sustainable, even if like powerful players don't want them to. So that's another thing that's exciting, and for sure. And I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all, but like we're happy to take questions about like where we're going in the future with regulation. Anything about like the what is crypto side. We just spent the whole day kind of fielding those kinds of questions at the meetups throughout the day, which has been awesome. But if you do have questions, line up to the mics there. Otherwise, we'll keep talking about some of the things going on. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, so I have these pins that say the revolution will be decentralized. There's a B on there. And I'll be handing them out at the end. So if you want one, then come and find me. These are made by the wonderful people at humanaction.io, who are actually sitting there in the audience there. But they have, like, if anyone's interested in economics, they have like Mises pins and Rothbard pins and like a cool hoodie that I wear all the time that says HODL. And so, yeah, check out their stuff, but I'll be giving away these pins. Very kind of you guys to have these if anyone wants some. All right, first question over there.
So I didn't have a question. I more so had a comment. Like you said, Naomi, you said the payment providers they have a lot of control. And when you were discussing about Coinbase, I just wanted to comment how you said they had a partnership with Neutrino. I am actually aware that Coinbase has partnered with PayPal with payment providing. I just wanted to make that comment, that they actually work together. And it's interesting how you said how much power PayPal has, and Coinbase is now partnered with them. So
I think that's a great thing to bring up. So if you're thinking about how cryptocurrency works and about the financial autonomy that it gives a person, you have to also realize that there are different degrees of this in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So Bitcoin enables you to hold your own coins and be your own security and be your own bank. But there are also third parties out there that operate like banks. You could give them your money, you could give them to an exchange, you could create a wallet somewhere, and they actually are the custodian of that. They hold it for you. Now, there are pros and cons to that. The pro is that it's really easy. Like if you're a beginner, you might want to set up a Coinbase account because you just literally put in your name and whatever and your ID and you're off to go. You can easily link your bank account. Very easy to use. The downside of that is that Coinbase owns your money now. And you're trusting them to give it back to you when you want it. You're trusting them not to do fractional reserve banking and have a bank run and then run off with your money. You're trusting them. There's a lot of responsibility you're giving them. And so there's a big debate in the Bitcoin community about whether or not you should hold your own coins or whether you should let a company hold it. So Coinbase is very much an institution. It's a big, large company, financial institution, and yes, they're partnering with these other tracking companies, and I just think it's very important to be aware if you're first getting into this space, do you fully understand whether or not you're holding your own Bitcoin or whether you've just signed up for a wallet where they hold it, because there's a huge difference there. So not everything in crypto is decentralized, not everything in crypto gives you financial autonomy and freedom. There's a lot of crossover in traditional finance. You have a lot of the same tools, so just do a lot of research before you get into that, depending on what you're after.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, with Coinbase, so they got sued by the IRS in 2017. Well, they fought the lawsuit for a year, and
that's interesting because people give Coinbase a lot of flack, but they did fight revealing information about their customers for a while.
Mm-hmm. And I think probably the IRS probably gave the same request for information to all the other exchanges, and the other exchanges probably just handed over what information they could, but Coinbase stopped and fought it and spent quite a considerable amount of money and resources in court. But the ultimate thing they found out was only like 816 Americans paid tax on their Bitcoin between 2014 and 2016, and there was something like 5 million Coinbase accounts. But Coinbase, it started off only selling Bitcoin, which was considered a commodity and not a security. So they didn't have to deal with the SEC in this. And then they added more coins. They added Litecoin, which was also sold or also generated from mining. Then they added Ethereum, which was sold via an initial coin offering. And it was interesting to watch at the Congress hearings last year. They argued tooth and nail that Ethereum was a commodity because it had been around long enough, and the ICO was before any notice of these things being potential securities violations when they're being sold. And then Coinbase...
Who knows what an ICO is, first of all?
Okay.
we might want to explain that. So it's like this way of raising capital for something by basically issuing a token in advance. So it stands for initial coin offering. It's kind of like an IPO, but in the crypto space. So you can kind of see those as analogous.
Mm-hmm. And then, the ICOs have been a huge way that crypto companies have raised money. You raise all this money up front. You don't even have to have a product ready. Then you sell these tokens, or the future tokens. Like you say, you're going to get some tokens later. Give us your money now, or your crypto now. And then there was a lot of fraud happened with them as well, where people never finished developing whatever they promised that they were going to develop. So that brought in the SEC to say, some of these things are securities. And then Coinbase recently listed a lot of these things that were securities. They got an ATS license, so they got a license as an alternative trading platform, so they're now allowed to sell securities just like a regular stock, not quite like a regular stock market, it could, but they have this special license, and they're the only, as far as I'm aware, they're the only crypto exchange with this license. And then if you go and look at their comments, so the CFTC, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, they're trying now to determine whether Ethereum, which is, I'm probably getting too into the weeds here.
It's interesting though. There'll be some people in the audience that this...
There's this other currency, basically, that was sold as an ICO, or initial coin offering. Anyway, the CFTC is trying to decide whether or not to take jurisdiction of it, and Coinbase turned around and tried to kind of put it under the bus that it is actually a security. After last year, when it benefited them for it to be a commodity, their whole rhetoric was, no, this is okay for us to trade without a license. Now that they're the only one with the license, they're saying this is a security. No one else should be allowed to trade it.
It's like regulatory capture at its finest, right? Make the rules so hard that only after we pass, but then you can make them hard so that no one else can hop in. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of that in any industry, and obviously it happens in crypto as well. And obviously there's a lot of it in traditional finance, and a lot of strong players who want to maintain their hold. They have really strong position. They're doing a lot of things. They don't want any of that power taken away, and suddenly you have competitors. So you are going to see that battle continuing as well. Let's take a question from over this side.
Yes, as far as mining goes, do you see the regulatory on because I'm in the mining portion of it, and there's actually a different market for, say, a virgin coin that's mined full node than if you mine it from a pool, because of the tracking mechanisms and things like that. So, and then without mining, I'm pretty sure the whole system would shut down anyway. So if there's regulatory actions on mining, they could pretty much, in essence, in my thoughts, maybe shut the whole thing down if they shut mining down. So,
but when, sorry, go ahead, Sasha.
Oh, I was going to say, what government could shut down mining, though, because it's happening all over the world. So if it was shut down in one country, the miners just pick up and move to another country that's more, inviting to them.
That's easy for them, but for me, I've got a bunch of machines here, so, I just can't pick machines up and move them. So
you actually saw that in
just
China
speaking
as
from
well.
that end of the business.
So what happens? It's going to be very difficult for smaller miners like yourself, unless you are willing to uproot and move to a different jurisdiction, like vote with your feet. Maybe different states, like Wyoming seems to be very crypto friendly. New York is very crypto unfriendly. So actually, you've seen a huge amount of people leave and go to Wyoming to set up their companies, etc. And China, even just the cost of electricity can make a big difference. When you had the drop in the market, you had Bitmain, for example, picked up a whole bunch of their miners, and they said, well, actually, we're going to move it to Iran because the electricity is cheaper there. Mm-hmm. So you really are going to see this fluid motion happening, where people are going to go wherever is most profitable, wherever it's most economically viable to keep their businesses going.
So you see that regulatory action on a state level instead of it being federally step in and say across the U.S. that...
I think it's going to be a battle. I think that the same way that drug legalization, you have the state saying one thing, you have the federal government saying another thing, and we're just going to have to see how that plays out.
I got you.
Yeah.
But they are, so the way they're considering mining for tax purpose is that it's income as soon as the mines are the coins are generated, and then then that would start your cost basis, and you have another cost when you sell them from a tax perspective. So I think as long as they're able to capture some tax off it, what's their incentive to make it really difficult for you to keep operating, unless it starts to really have a big battle with the banks or something like that.
That's what I'm saying. I just thought they could go to that level and it pretty much controls every level above it. You see what I'm saying? So all the stuff y'all were talking about, if it hits the mining level, then everything else is a moot point because.
Well, I think what Sasha said to begin with is really the crux here. We're dealing with a global marketplace now. This isn't country specific. So no, they couldn't kill a coin by shutting down mining because you have an entire world that's participating in this economy right now. So unless you had some collusion where every single country was on the same page, which, I mean, really, you see Russia and China and the US all holding hands nicely and saying, yeah, let's all get together and have lunch. I mean, it's probably not. You're always going to have this power struggle across the world, and because of that, you're going to have different jurisdictions having different laws. So I think in that respect, it's going to remain more or less decentralized. Let's go to the question over here.
Yes, so my question kind of goes to the, I guess you would say, the face of regulation. So you mentioned the bit licensing hearings in 2014. It was just a lot of bureaucrats and older folks. I know it's like the Facebook Senate hearings. They spent like half of it explaining how the internet works and what that is.
That was so beautiful.
So I was wondering,
so how do you monetize Facebook if no one has to pay for an account? It's like, oh,
it was entertaining.
Adorable.
It was entertaining. But my question is, other than what we see like on C-SPAN or you read in the newspaper, do you all know if like the Treasury Department or these other regulatory agencies, are they realistically like going after poaching, top like MIT, Caltech, places like that, or is it still a bunch of 60, 70-year-old regulators who've been doing this for 50 years trying to get a grasp on what's going on?
I would say like the best technologists in the world, I mean, the NSA has a bunch of them, right? It's going to be down to individual preference. Maybe you could have the government offering more money, maybe the private sector would offer more money and people are incentivized by money, or maybe they're incentivized by the project itself. I know a lot of technologists, for example, are incentivized by the open source movement. They would much rather participate in a project, even for free, when they're getting no monetary value, just because they want to see something beautiful created in the world that they want to be part of. So I think it really, I mean, you're talking about different departments there, and I'd say on the technologist level, yeah, I think you're always going to have smart people who are involved in some degree. In terms of like the regulatory level, maybe you'd be better off. I'm going to be pretty negative there. It seems like there are a lot of uninformed people. I'm very optimistic. There are some people out there that are doing awesome things, but they're like a handful of people that I'm noticing, but maybe you have a different perspective.
Yeah, I know, I agree. When you have the congressional hearings, you see all these different representatives with really vast opinions on what it is. And I think certain groups, like in DC, there's a government blockchain movement, and there's a lot of groups that have really tried to reach out and work with the government. They take a lot of flack in the Bitcoin community because the government movement of it is counter to the freedom movement of Bitcoin, but I think those type of groups have done a good job at spreading the message to certain government officials that maybe there's more to this technology than just a payment service or a nefarious actor trying to, buy something illegal with the money. And so they've put it into the supply chain, and you see people like Walmart, putting lettuce on the supply chain, or all these other types of uses of database and calling it, the blockchain, which it is. It's different. They're private blockchains. But I think because all of that is starting to come up, the government is looking at it and saying, oh, maybe there are some good uses for this other than illegal uses. So it's creating more confusion, but it's probably a good conversation that they're moving towards with that kind of stuff.
I also would say that for anyone interested in this is really a call to action for you, because so much of government policy is created not because they're experts in every ordinary field, because they're not. They're relying on people to give them information. The information they get is generally from lobbyists, right? You look at what happened in Wyoming when you had these bills on the table that basically would not allow an individual to actually have ownership of a digital asset. They had this bill that proposed you should always go through this intermediary. It should be a financial institution because we need to protect people. It needs to be routed through them. So they were basically further entrenching traditional finance, trying to entrench it in the world of crypto by saying individuals should not have the right to own these things themselves. It should always be through a broker. And what you had was this amazing group called the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, led by a volunteer who received absolutely no money from this, but just really wanted to see blockchain succeed, fight this, and they've got a bill through now that recognizes ownership rights for an individual. So that sort of stuff is really exciting, and I would really advocate for anyone interested in this. If you want to see awesome things happening in Kentucky, you know, there are two bills that I would recommend, and you probably know the names of them specifically better than I do, but I would recommend that you write to your representatives and say, these are two things that I'm really excited about, because honestly, they're waiting for information from their supporters, from their constituents. They want to hear what people want, you know, because they want to be re-elected, right? And so if you guys can be vocal about this stuff, then you can actually get good bills through. And you're right, like there is kind of this clash, like maybe we should just ignore government, but the reality is we live in the United States. We have to operate under the United States laws, otherwise you're going to go to jail, you know? So if you're going to be living in that and you don't want to go to jail or risk that, then it's probably a good idea to try and make the laws as favorable as possible to, you know, financial freedom or whatever you want to get. So like it's interesting because there is going to be this, there's a lot of money in the lobbyists for traditional finance. They have a lot of resources, and so it is a bit of a power imbalance there, but great things are being done at the moment just with volunteers and people passionate. So I would advocate, if you're excited about this stuff, get on board, have a say, try and get good laws passed in your state.
Thank you.
You almost answered it for me, but could you elaborate on some of the crypto laws that were passed in Wyoming? And do you think it's a step in the right direction?
Sure.
Yeah. You want to go first?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, I guess the first and biggest one happened last spring. Well, they passed 5 last spring, but one of the main ones was that they recognized a consumer token, which meant it was outside, that it wasn't going to be regulated as a security, even if it was sold with an initial coin offering, which is different than the federal laws that said anything sold with an initial coin offering is a security. And the important distinction with that is if you're selling a security, you either have to do it as an IPO, which is very expensive and pretty much impossible for a new startup company, or you sell it through something like Regulation D, which requires that you limit the investors to only accredited investors who have at least $200,000 in individual income for the last 2 years, or they have $1 million net worth. So that really limits the pool of options, you know, for people to invest in these companies. And so Wyoming said you don't have to go through that rigmarole if you're going to be here. But then they continued to expand on that with all this custody stuff. So Wyoming at one point had a terrible money transmission regulation in place for cryptocurrency. They were one of the only places that needed it, they were counting it in their as money, so you need a special license to do that, and they needed something like a $1 million bond for the company to get that license. So then they took that requirement off and said that you don't, for crypto to crypto exchange, you don't need to get that license in place. And then they also created a chancery court. So the same way that Delaware has a special court just for dealing with corporate or business issues, Wyoming has created a court that's going to have 3 judges that are well versed in blockchain law, and they'll serve on the bench there. I think I saw it was a 5 or 10 year term, so you can imagine how much they're going to understand the individual complexities of these issues as they come up. And then the other big thing was the ownership. So you don't have to own it through a custodian service. And they did 13 new laws. They created a bank that can specifically do banking for virtual currency companies, which So the FDIC insures all the banks. Like every deposit you put in a bank, it's insured by this organization, the FDIC. They have said, we will not insure companies that are dealing with nefarious activities, which don't even have to be nefarious, but Bitcoin has had a real...
They use this not just in crypto,
Yeah.
so they've used this in states where medical marijuana is legal, for example, but they will shut down bank accounts of anyone dealing with medical marijuana. So it's a way of controlling people's actions through a different perspective, saying like, well, you're a risky business, so we're not going to insure any bank account associated with that. And what's the bank left to do in a situation like that? If they don't have insurance covering what's happening in their account, they're not going to offer bank accounts. So you have all these bank accounts in certain sectors systematically shut down. And that's a huge issue. So this idea of having an institution purely for cryptocurrency, it's 100% reserve required, which means that you don't need insurance if there's no fractional reserve banking there. They have all the reserves there. So it's a different business model, and it would allow people to have the autonomy of having a bank account, if the bank lets them, because FDIC can't put pressure on them in that instance, which is really, really exciting.
Mm-hmm. I think that those are all the ones I can think of offhand, but there's 13 others, so maybe I missed a few.
That's just a big thing. Like already a law in Wyoming, which is interesting, is that rehypothecation is illegal, meaning that you can't take someone's money and then use that money as to leverage a new loan or as collateral for something else. That's being used once. So what's happened in the past, obviously, you get money put in a bank, and then the bank can lend it out to that person and that person and that, and they can do all these things with the money. So Wyoming already has a law that doesn't allow rehypothecation. So that's going to be interesting in terms of in crypto as well, because a lot of people are worried that, oh, well, what happened in traditional finance will just happen in crypto. You have these exchanges. How do we know that they actually have my Bitcoin? We had proof of keys, which anyone participate in proof of keys? All right, I'll explain what this was. It was this idea that on January 3rd, the idea that everyone, if you had your money in an exchange or like a bank, you should all pull it out on the same day. Like if someone else is holding your money, let's all use January 3rd and pull that money out, because they wanted to test and see if they actually had the reserves there. If they weren't taking in this money and then loaning it out to 10 other people, and I have an IOU that says you owe me 1 Bitcoin, but that's 10 people have the exact same IOU. So if we all pull it out at the same time, this exchange goes bust. So it's this idea of, do they actually hold our assets? And so in crypto, a lot of people are worried about this. They're worried that, and exchanges are doing this. We know that they're doing this. They do have fractional reserves, and they make a lot of money off this. So a lot of people in crypto, they want financial autonomy. They don't want their money to, not be there when they call on it. So this idea of, rehypothecation being illegal, it's definitely works into a crypto ethos, which is why I think Wyoming is so popular for cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just wanted to know, you touched on it, but what are your thoughts on governments trying to avoid sanctions by creating their own cryptocurrency? As well, if you think crypto will be a net good or net bad once more people start using it because of the different political issues happening, like Brexit in the UK, and people not relying on their own economies to actually value their money.
So there were 2 questions there. Net good or net bad for crypto, and what happens when governments create their own coins, etc. I mean, we could talk about the petro, which Venezuela has created their own cryptocurrency. It's pegged to the bolivar, and it's been an abject failure. It's been completely opaque. They just created this funny money that has no accountability at all, and you can't sell it on the free market, so you can't trade it on exchanges, so there's no price discovery of like, how much is this thing actually worth, how much is someone willing to pay for this, do you trust the Venezuelan government enough to actually buy this cryptocurrency, do you know how much is in existence, like there's so much opaqueness there that we really don't know where it stands, and furthermore you can't even buy it on Venezuelan exchanges, so this is not purchasable for people on exchanges, so things like that, I mean you have governments trying that sort of stuff. And if it's too opaque, you see that people aren't going to use it unless they're forced to. So that's the definition of fiat. It means by decree, right? So you're going to have governments, maybe they'll introduce cryptocurrency and it'll be by decree. Maybe they'll say every transaction you make will have to be on the blockchain so we can track it. That's a real possibility that I'm sure a lot of governments are very interested in right now. Then there's the other side of things. Maybe you have a government that doesn't have as much power, and you have the people who are very vocal. They might insist that the government does everything on a blockchain. There could be repercussions of that too. If every tax dollar that I send is instantaneously divided and put in the pockets of all the places where my tax money goes, you've got a system of accountability set up right there and transparency. If I could actually see where all of my money goes, maybe I'd have more of an uproar about giving this much money if it's ending up in Senator such and such's pocket for his lobster dinner. So there could be a good side to governments using that there as well. And then there could just be like exactly what we have now, where a lot of governments are saying, transactions over $10,000 in cash are now illegal. Australian government's done that. Every transaction you make above that amount has to go through a financial institution, has to be with your bank card so they can track that. You're going to see more and more countries talking about cash being made illegal. You may see people going in this direction, but we're already going in that direction with or without blockchain. So yeah, there could be many different tracks that governments could take. Net good or net bad? I think net good because you always see technology staying one step ahead. And I think that definitely with people testing out privacy coins and all of that, there are definitely people in the crypto space in particular who are very much interested in financial privacy. They believe they have the right to financial privacy, and so they're always going to be supporting things that help support that. Better encryption tools, better decentralized tools that can't be shut down, that are censorship resistant. There's a lot of that in crypto, so I think that's always going to continue, and that Sasha really nailed it when she said that there are going to be two tracks. One of them is going to be this very decentralized track, and one of them is going to be this very regulatory friendly hand-in-hand track of compliance. Anything you want to add? Or?
I think you nailed it.
We're currently in the Wild West stage of cryptocurrency right now, some would say. Binance is going into Malta and Africa in order to give us some positive regulation. Do you see how that could be only positive? There are some negatives with it. And also, for everybody else, what sites do you use to get your news for like the Wyoming bills and whatnot? What do you use to inform yourself?
I use Twitter a lot. I think if you go right to the source, Caitlin Long, she'll do tweet storms about the Wyoming.
So she's the co-founder of the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, who did all that awesome work getting those bills passed. And Telegram is a great channel for crypto news. And there's certain companies, I guess, that put news out on Twitter. Like Bitcoin Magazine is a great source. They've been around in this space for a long time, and they recently made a move to go back to focusing on Bitcoin only. And their news articles are very well. Usually they're correct, and you can trust them. And that's a big challenge in this industry because sometimes people are just publishing stuff that is way off. Yeah, it's there's certain people that I guess you just get to know on Twitter that are trustworthy. Yeah, I just started a partnership with Crypto Insider, which is another news outlet. So I really like them. That's why I decided to work with them to produce content. So you learn just through research and asking other people what's great out there. And I'm always happy, in private, to recommend different sources that I love, that I trust as well. What was your first part of your question?
Binance.
Different countries.
Yeah, what are your thoughts? Do you think that's only going to be a positive? Do you think they could possibly do what PayPal did and cut off other companies that want to sell cryptocurrency to people and say they can't work with them?
Well, as long as governments always have that power to give out, and they can be captured, then you're always going to have that risk, right? So it could be good or it could be bad. You do see a lot of regulatory capture. It's really sad to see, but the good thing is that you do have competing jurisdictions all over the world. You have, New York is no longer the financial capital of the world, in my opinion, because the financial ecosystem has shifted, and they have killed the new stuff, innovative stuff that's happening there. And you've been looking at other countries who've been saying, we will become the new financial capital of the world. London will be the center. Gibraltar will be the center. All of these countries are now competing for this title, right? Because it's lucrative. If you're the center of all the bustling things happening in one of the most cutting edge, innovative industries in the world that is probably hiring the most people that we've seen, like for every 19 jobs as a blockchain developer, you have like one qualified person to fill it. So if you guys are students here looking for work, this may be an interesting field to go into. Like look into programming, look into learning to be a blockchain developer, because this is a burgeoning industry that is really taking off. So as long as you have all of that to offer and you know that there are all these potential jobs to be had, if you're a smart politician or leader, you're going to want those to come to your jurisdiction. You're going to want the most friendly regulation possible to invite those people there. I think we're going to see things take off in Wyoming, even though Wyoming is part of the overall US financial system. You're seeing so many companies in the US move over there. Lots of different places around America that's looking favorable. Places like Nevada, not so favorable. New York, not so favorable. Like they're passing really bad bills, and companies just not going to move there. So I am looking at places like Gibraltar. I emceed a conference there I think 2 years ago, and it was exciting just to hear from the officials there, and it's small enough that it's they're nimble, they're flexible. Maybe we're going to see the smaller countries in the world thrive rather than the big behemoths. Maybe we're going to start to see a power balance start to shift. America has been probably the most dominant force in the world for a long time. But if these smaller countries are flexible enough to invite some of this cutting edge technology and they can be a bastion for that tech, maybe that could start to even the scales, even just a little bit, which could be interesting. I've been to a lot of places in Eastern Europe, emceeing conferences where you talk to people there, and they all see this potential. They all want to get on board. They're all trying to figure out how they can do this. What can they implement to get people involved? It's exciting out there. We've been a bit doom and gloom with like the terrorists and government, and but there's some really exciting things happening there, some really exciting technologies and laws being passed. So we're just going to have to see what plays out. I don't have a prediction. Do you have a prediction for what's going to be the stronghold?
Well, I think Binance is really doing some innovative things with their how they're structuring. So they've taken little pieces of their company and registered it in a lot of different countries. So what Binance is basically, according to American law, they're way out of compliance. They're selling securities. They're not requiring KYC for over, I think they're letting people do 2 Bitcoin worth a week without KYCing. So they're way out of compliance with FinCEN and with the SEC, but they're not getting shut down. And CZ, their CEO, he said he is sometimes, he said he is complying with the laws even though they're not registered in certain times, but by setting up shop all over the world with individual fractions, it's really quite a smart way to do it. And each area of the world their securities laws are developing differently around these tokens, where Switzerland has said there are consumer tokens. So if you're selling an ICO in Europe, the way they typically define if something's a security or not is whether or not it pays a dividend. They don't have a body of case law based on a 1946 case of selling orange groves and creating that to
which is how the entire SEC infrastructure is built, which seems very strange, right? It all stems from this one Howie case.
So if Binance has a bit of itself registered in Switzerland, then they're compliant. What jurisdiction is going to apply? It's going to be a jurisdictional arbitrage over them. And I think the SEC in America, who's been the most active in their enforcement actions against cryptocurrency companies, they are picking the lowest hanging fruit that they know they can win on. And Binance, I don't know if they could win against that right now. And it would be a big battle, and it would be resource intensive. So Binance just seems to be getting a free pass to make a lot of money right now before getting and not getting in trouble. Whereas you have another exchange, Ether Delta, that was a completely, supposedly a completely decentralized exchange that one guy in America, in Chicago, had set up, and he actually sold it to someone else before getting an enforcement action against him, but because he had profited on every one of these decentralized transactions that happened on Ether Delta, they said he was, that was enough to link him to the creation of it, and he got charged with operating this unregistered securities exchange. But if you look at all the enforcement actions so far, they're just taxes. They're not on the securities side. No one has gone to jail, and the fines have been between $200,000 and $400,000, or giving back the money that you did earn. So it hasn't been very punitive yet, but I think it's just each time there is an enforcement action, though, it's getting bigger and bigger.
Well, they're setting up a reservoir, right? If you set up a heap of precedents, like if the only fine you need to pay or repercussion is a slap on the wrist and pay $2.50, you're probably going to be like, oh, pay $2.50 or hire a lawyer for a ton of money and fight this. So you're probably just going to pay the fine. So what the SEC is doing currently is setting up a long chain of precedents so that when they finally do go after bigger players, they can probably refer to this and say, hey, this has been upheld in all of these cases, so it just makes their case stronger when they start to ramp up.
And just, thank you.
Well, I think this is really exciting, and going to blockchain is really important.
Thank you for having us.